The sky above Schweinfurt in October 1943 was a boiling cauldron of smoke and death. B-17 Flying Fortress bombers, flying in tight formation, the famous combat box, were the prey, and the Luftwaffe were the apex predators. For the American bomber crews, the odds felt impossible. Day after day, the Germans unleashed a terrifying efficiency that seemed to defy the laws of aerial combat. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf FW-190, sleek, powerful, and armed with devastating cannon, were flown by the Experten, pilots with hundreds of victories. They didn't just attack, they tore through the formations with brutal, surgical precision. This was the brutal reality of the European Theater of Operations ETO in 1943. American bomber losses were unsustainable. The 8th Air Force was being bled white, their missions often called suicide runs. German fighters were, for all intents and purposes, unstoppable. They seemed faster, climbed better, and possessed a magical ability to always return to the fight, even when cornered. How did the Allies break this dominance? It wasn't a new aircraft or a secret weapon. It was an accidental discovery made by one P51 Mustang pilot during a desperate, near-fatal escape. A desperate act that seemed to break every rule of aerial physics and exposed a critical, hidden vulnerability in the mighty German war machine. To understand the sheer terror of facing the Luftwaffe, you must understand their aircraft and their pilots. The two primary German fighters were engineering marvels of their time. The Messerschmitt Bf-109, light, incredibly fast in a climb, and highly maneuverable at altitude. Its powerful Daimler-Benz DB605 engine used a supercharger that gave it incredible performance above 2,000 feet, the altitude where the B-17s flew. It was an altitude specialist, often appearing out of the sun and vanishing back into the high air after an attack. The Focke-Wulf FW-190, the Butcher Bird, was a rugged, devastating powerhouse powered by the radial BMW 801 engine. The FW-190 was a master of boom and zoom tactics. It could absorb more damage than Allied fighters and packed a heavier punch, often carrying 4 or more cannon. It excelled at diving attacks and low to medium altitude combat, frequently employed to tear apart the bomber formations. American pilots, flying P-47 Thunderbolts and early P-51 Mustangs, were facing pilots who had been fighting since the Spanish Civil War or the Battle of Britain. These Experten had honed their skills in an environment of constant combat. The Luftwaffe used a devastating combination of tactics: the high-altitude attack, where Bf-109s would attack from above the bomber stream and zoom back up to escape the bomber's defensive fire; the head-on pass executed by FW-190s to force B-17 gunners to aim forward where their protection was weakest; and critically, the sustained climb. If an American fighter engaged a Bf-109, the German pilot's instinct was to enter a vertical climb. Thanks to the power-to-weight ratio in the supercharged engine, the Messerschmitt could often outclimb the American fighter, gaining altitude and energy advantage to return to the attack. Trying to match the climb was suicidal, and running in level flight often meant losing energy and altitude, which was equally dangerous. The American pilots were stuck. They couldn't outclimb them, which was the key to maintaining a position of advantage. The German pilots, confident in their machine's superior high-altitude performance and climb rate, believed they could escape any American fighter simply by going vertical. It was this absolute reliance on their superior climb performance, their tactical escape hatch, that was their greatest strength, and ultimately, their undoing. The pivotal moment arrived during a brutal escort mission over Kassel in September 1943. Captain Jacob "Jake" Miller, flying a brand-new P-51B Mustang, one of the first to reach the front, was separated from his squadron in the chaos. He had just broken off an attack on a flight of FW-190s when a flight of 3 Bf-109s, led by an ace recognizable by the unique markings on his spinner, descended on him. Miller took a cannon hit to his tail, momentarily stunning him. His controls were mushy, his elevator partially jammed. The German ace, now alone, easily settled onto Miller's 6 o'clock. Miller knew the drill. He couldn't turn, he couldn't outrun him, and he certainly couldn't climb. The Messerschmitt was closing for the kill. With no options left, Miller tried a desperate, last-second maneuver. It wasn't in any manual. Instead of diving away or trying to climb, Miller did the exact opposite of what the German ace expected. He dropped his nose slightly, built a fraction of speed, and then, at about 15,000 feet, he pulled the stick violently back into a screaming, tight loop, a maneuver that generated near breakneck positive G-forces, pushing him into his seat. Miller was certain he would black out. He grunted, strained, and fought the crushing G-forces that turned his vision gray. The P-51, with its robust, heavy wings and the powerful new Packard Merlin engine, was an unforgiving beast, but it held together. The German ace, caught completely off guard, instantly tried to match the turn. His plane had to follow the same brutal arc. But the Bf-109 wasn't built for that kind of punishment, especially not the sustained, high-speed, low-altitude, high-G turn. The Messerschmitt was optimized for the high-altitude vertical fight. As Miller's P-51 completed the impossible-feeling loop, he glanced in his mirror. The Bf-109 was suddenly behind the curve, its nose wobbling, its climb rate dramatically reduced. The German pilot was struggling to control the aircraft in the low-altitude, high-speed, high-G environment. Then the unthinkable happened. The German fighter's engine sputtered, coughed, and belched a plume of thick white smoke. The Bf-109, moments from victory, began to bleed energy and speed dramatically. It was no longer a predator, it was coasting. Miller, who had barely held consciousness, instantly understood the advantage. He reversed his turn, easily got on the German's tail, and with a short, brutal burst from his .650 caliber machine guns, ended the fight. The German pilot, who had outclimbed and outflown countless others, was now spiraling, defeated by a simple, brutal high-G turn. What Jake Miller had accidentally discovered was not a flaw in the German fighter's airframe, but a critical vulnerability in the Daimler-Benz DB605 engine's fuel delivery system under sustained high-G forces at lower altitude. The German engineers had been brilliant. The DB605 engine in the Bf-109 used a direct fuel injection system, unlike the Allied fighters' carburetors early in the war. This was a major advantage, allowing the German aircraft to maneuver more violently without suffering fuel starvation during inverted or negative G maneuvers. However, the Achilles heel was the fuel pump and the engine management system itself, combined with the extreme forces. During an extremely tight, sustained high-G turn, the fuel pump and its complex intake system struggled to keep up with the demands of the engine, especially when the G-force momentarily starved the system. While many American pilots wrongly assumed the German engine used a carburetor because it would sputter, in reality, the momentary fuel starvation caused by the extreme G-forces was forcing the injection system to work beyond its design limits for sustained periods, making the engine lose power and bog down. More importantly, the Bf-109's engine was heavily optimized for high-altitude combat, where the air density was lower. At 15,000 feet, performing a maneuver that generated 7 to 8 Gs put stresses on the engine that it was simply not designed to handle for more than a second or two. The P-51's Merlin engine, while complex, was better balanced for all altitude performance and possessed a more robust fuel system under very G loads. In short, when the German pilot tried to match Miller's desperate, high-G, sustained tight turn, the engine management system choked. The expertise lost all momentum, and their greatest strength, their energy advantage, was instantly nullified. Before we look at how this single discovery changed the course of the air war and shattered the morale of the expertin, please consider hitting the subscribe button. We dive deep into the untold stories of World War II and the desperate acts of courage that turned the tide of history. Subscribing helps keep these crucial, often forgotten tactical tales alive. Miller's discovery wasn't just a lucky escape, it was a tactical blueprint. He wasn't the first to pull a hard G-turn, but he was the first to recognize why the German plane broke off and why his engine survived when the enemy's didn't. Word of the Miller Loop, or the high-G reversal, spread like wildfire through the 8th Air Force fighter groups. Pilots realized that when a German fighter got on their tail, they had a new option that defied convention. Don't climb, their advantage. Don't dive, the trade-off. But instead perform the high-G, tight turn. At medium altitude, 1,000 to 2,000 feet, They would force the German pilot to match a violent, sustained turn. When the Expertin tried to match the turn, their engines would sputter and lose power. The American pilot could then pull out of the G-turn with sufficient energy, while the German aircraft was left sluggish, momentarily crippled in an easy target. The fight immediately and violently reversed. The arrival of the P51 Mustang in force was perfectly timed to exploit this flaw. The Mustang was already an exceptional dogfighter. Its laminar flow wing, coupled with the powerful Packard Merlin engine, gave it an enormous operational range and excellent high-speed characteristics. Suddenly, the Americans weren't just escorting, they were hunting. The new tactical reality was the P-51 had superior sustained high G performance, while the Bf-109 only had a superior climb rate. The American pilots learned to lure the Messerschmitts down into the medium-altitude trap, then force them into a sustained, high G turn that their engine system couldn't handle. The German High Command, the Reichsluftfahrtministerium RLM, initially dismissed the change. They believed their Experten were simply facing better armored targets or more aggressive pilots. But the loss reports quickly told a different story. The psychological impact on the German pilots was immediate and devastating. Their supreme confidence, the belief that they could always escape danger by simply climbing away, was shattered. The loss of the escape clause meant that if a German pilot made a mistake and an American got on his tail, the traditional escape maneuver, the vertical climb, was now a death sentence. The American would follow, force the high G turn, and the German engine would cut out. This led to moral decay. The Expertin began to hesitate, unwilling to press an attack for fear of being forced into the fatal G-turn. A single moment of hesitation in air combat is often the difference between life and death. The most painful losses were those of the top aces. They were the most aggressive and thus the most likely to be forced into the high G trap. When famous Experten began to fall to the high G reversal, the morale of the entire Luftwaffe fighter arm plummeted. By 1944, the situation was catastrophic for the Luftwaffe. The influx of long-range P-51s and P-47s, combined with the new tactical knowledge, meant the hunters were hunted. American fighters could now accompany the bombers all the way to their targets and then stay to hunt the defending fighters. The Germans were losing their experienced Experten at an alarming rate, and the new pilots simply couldn't compete against Americans who had discovered the secret flaw. The flaw was in the fundamental design of the engine's management system under stress. It was not a fix that could be solved overnight with a new fuel pump. It required a complete overhaul of the engine's operational envelope, a complexity the Germans could not afford during the height of the war. The myth of the unstoppable German fighter was over. The tight, high G turn, once a simple combat maneuver, had been weaponized into the ultimate German fighter killer. The victory over the Luftwaffe was not a single event. It was the cumulative effect of strategic bombing, industrial might, and crucially, tactical innovation. But the discovery of the German engine's high G weakness was arguably the most significant tactical turning point. By early 1944, the American fighters were not only dominating the airspace over Germany, but were also engaging in strafe missions, attacking German airfields, trains, and infrastructure at low altitude. This was only possible because they had secured air superiority over the German fighters. Bomber losses dropped dramatically. The B-17s and B-24s could finally fly their deep penetration missions with reasonable odds of survival, delivering the punishing blow that crippled the German war machine. The morale boost for the American fighter and bomber crews was immense. They knew they had the edge, not just in numbers, but in tactical knowledge. The legacy of the high G reversal lives on in modern aerial combat doctrine. Today, fighter energy management is the core of dogfighting. The lesson learned over Castle, that you must fight on your aircraft's terms, not the enemy's, is still taught at the world's elite fighter pilot schools. The German engineers, brilliant as they were, had optimized their engines for a perceived strategic advantage, the climb to high altitude. They had created an aircraft that was superb in its intended envelope, but fatally flawed outside of it. The very strength they relied on to dominate the air, the high G, high-altitude performance of the DB-605, was the hidden vulnerability that one American pilot, facing death, accidentally discovered. The German fighters were unstoppable. They were superior in many ways that mattered. But Captain Jake Miller's high G pull-ups shattered that illusion, proving that in war, a small, often overlooked design detail can be the difference between supremacy and total defeat. The war in the air was won not with a better aircraft, but with better tactics, tactics born from desperation and a willingness to try the impossible.